You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth. Hey!
Spanning the globe to bring you the latest developments in medical cannabis, adult marijuana, industrial hemp, and spiritual ganja. It's time for the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville. Now, here's your host, Russ Belville.
Good day, tokers and tokettes and non-toking lovers of liberty. It is Tuesday, July 11th, 2017, and it's got to be 420 somewhere in the world. Welcome to the show. Glad to have you here at Delta 9 House and Studios for another fabulous edition of the program. Coming up on the show today, we've got our cannabis headline news. All sorts of interesting stories going on there. In our Sensible Future segment with SSDP, Katie Stone joins us. She's an SSDP alum from UC Davis. She's working on environmental sustainability and corporate responsibility in the marijuana industry. It'll be a very good discussion. Coming up in the middle of the show, the guide there is wrong because we've actually got a drug war data mining segment. This is late breaking news coming from the Drug Policy Alliance, which has released a new report on the need to decriminalize drugs and the continuing arrest disparities in New York City. So we'll take a look at that in our drug war data mining. In our Freedom Leaf preview, we've got editor-in-chief Steve Bloom joining us. They got a special issue coming up for July-August, which details the 50-year anniversary of the Summer of Love from 1967. And in the Radical Rant, I'll tell you how the DEA thinks like the Nazis and the Hutus in a rant based off of our Reefer Madness debunked from yesterday. All that coming up and more in hour two, right here on the Marijuana Agenda.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
Hi, I'm Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda. Putting together the most comprehensive live weekday marijuana news talk program is a full-time job. Now you can do your part to ensure that listener-supported independent cannabis radio journalism can continue by becoming a patron of the Marijuana Agenda. Just log on to mjagenda.com and click the Become a Patron button. For your $4.20 monthly donation, you'll receive over 20 hours of original first-hour podcasts, plus other materials only available to paid subscribers. Or for just $9.99 a month, become a VIP patron. You'll get over 40 hours of podcasts for the complete program, including Toker Talk Radio, plus ad-free downloads of the segments heard on the Marijuana Agenda. Plus, VIPs get exclusive access to the video replay of the 2-hour live stream show and downloads of the spreadsheets and charts I provide from my years of curating marijuana data sets. Thank you for your support, and remember, I cannot do it without you. Please become a patron today at mjagenda.com.
As a formerly incarcerated person, I know firsthand all the ways that we are disenfranchised when we are run through the system. Every day I work to help people regain their rights and dignity, but the fight is far from over. We need you to join us in this important fight. This October, we're coming to Atlanta for the 2017 Drug Policy Alliance Reform Conference. Join us in the fight to end the drug war. Register now at reformconference.org.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
I'm Russ Belville with the Marijuana Agenda. Join me every 2 weeks for Police for Reform with Law Enforcement Action Partnership. Learn more at mjagenda.com/about.
This is your Cannabis Headline News. Brought to you by MarijuanaMoment.net, the complete source for all your marijuana news in one morning newsletter from Marijuana Majority Founder Tom Angel. Subscribe today for free at MarijuanaMoment.net.
This is your Cannabis Headline News for Tuesday, July 11th, 2017. I'm Russ Belville. Michigan Live reports that organizers of a Michigan petition drive to legalize recreational use of marijuana say they're ahead of schedule to get the required number of signatures by the November 22nd deadline. The Coalition to Regulate Marijuana Like Alcohol has collected more than 100,000 signatures in less than 7 weeks of circulating petitions, Kremla said in a press release. The wording of the ballot proposal was approved by the Board of State Canvassers on May 18th, and the group was given 180 days from May 26th to collect 252,523 valid signatures to place the question on Michigan's November 2018 ballot. If approved by Michigan voters in November 2018, the initiative would legalize personal possession, cultivation, and use of limited amounts of cannabis for adults 21 and older. It would also legalize the cultivation of industrial hemp, license marijuana businesses that cultivate, process, test, transport, and sell marijuana, establish testing and safety regulations for retail marijuana, and tax marijuana at levels with a 10% excise tax and a 6% sales tax. According to Reuters, a U.S. judge has rejected a former Insys Therapeutics Inc. employee's arguments that he had a constitutional right to use marijuana while under indictment for what federal prosecutors call a scheme to pay kickbacks to doctors to prescribe an opioid drug. Jeffrey Perlman, a former Insys district sales manager, had sought to modify his bail conditions so that he could continue using marijuana prescribed by a New Jersey doctor to help kick an opioid addiction he developed after a spine injury. Perlman is one of several former employees and executives of Arizona-based Insys to face U.S. charges related to Subsys, an under-the-tongue spray intended for cancer patients containing fentanyl, an addictive and regulated synthetic opioid. Prosecutors said Perlman and sales representatives he managed induced doctors, advanced practice registered nurses, and physician's assistants to prescribe Insys fentanyl spray by paying them to participate in sham speaker programs. John Morgan, the man who backed Florida's Amendment 2, says in a report on WCTV that the legislature's failure to include smoking in its medical marijuana implementation will speed up the process of legalizing recreational marijuana. Morgan is suing the state for banning smoking in the final medical marijuana law. He believes voters didn't get what they asked for and will take their anger out by voting for all-out legalization. Florida's arm of Drug Free America says those truly upset about the exclusion of smoking are for the most part not patients, but people who were hoping for recreational use from the beginning. Quote, if they can vape, I don't see what the argument is about not being able to smoke, end quote, says Amy Ronshausen, the deputy director of DFA. Patient advocates respond that vaporization requires disposable pens that litter the environment or expensive reusable devices not everyone can afford. Advocates also point to the portability and ease of simply rolling herb in a paper and lighting a match compared to the charging of batteries or plug-in electricity vaporization requires. Arrests by police in Washington, D.C. for the public use of marijuana nearly tripled in 2016 and are on track to remain high in 2017, public records show. More than 400 people were arrested in 2016 for public consumption of marijuana, according to D.C. police arrest records obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request by the Washington Post. Records show 78 had been arrested as of April 5th. That compares with 142 people arrested in 2015, the year that marijuana use but not sale became legal in the city. Arrests for distribution of marijuana also nearly tripled last year from 80 in 2015 to 220 in 2016, according to the data. State health officials have set a tentative timeline for establishing a medical marijuana industry in North Dakota with a goal of having the drug available to patients next spring, says Associated Press. The health department is asking those interested in manufacturing or distributing medical cannabis to notify the agency by July 28th. The requested letters of intent aren't binding, but should give officials an idea of the amount of interest. The health department tentatively plans to open the application process in early August and close it at the end of September. The agency would review applications in October and make selections in early November. Officials estimate it'll take manufacturers about 6 months to set up facilities and grow the first crop of medical cannabis. If the timeline plays out, cannabis would be available to patients in April, May, or June of next year. This has been your Cannabis Headline News for Tuesday, July 11th, 2017. I'm Russ Belville.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
If you work in the cannabis industry, consume marijuana, or just support freedom, you need to know about breaking policy news that affects you. Marijuana Moment is the daily newsletter that helps you stay on top of all the latest and most important state, federal, and international cannabis developments. Brought to you by longtime legalization activist Tom Angel, Marijuana Moment puts a concise yet comprehensive overview of cannabis news in your inbox early every weekday morning. Wake up to Marijuana Moment and rest assured you'll be ready for the cannabis news that's driving the day. Subscribe now at marijuanamoment.net.
Hey, this is Willie Nelson for Norman. and I smoke pot and I like it a lot. I learned a long time ago that marijuana is a lot safer than alcohol. There's nothing wrong with the responsible use of marijuana by adults. It's time we stopped arresting and started respecting those who smoke marijuana responsibly. To learn what you can do to help, contact NORML at NORML.org or call toll-free 888-67-NORMAL.
The marijuana agenda, like the alcohol agenda. But a lot safer.
I'm Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda. Join me every 4 weeks for the Northwest Cannabis Chronicle from the Marijuana Business Association. Learn more at mjagenda.com/about.
This is A Sensible Future, brought to you by Students for Sensible Drug Policy at SSDP.org. Drug policy is an issue that primarily affects the young, both in terms of use and legal prosecution. SSDP believes in honest education about drugs and advocates for harm reduction policies to protect young adults and society at large. We speak with another dedicated activist from SSDP, working toward a sensible future.
Welcome to another edition of A Sensible Future, the podcast for Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Find out more about the organization at ssdp.org. I'm Russ Belville, and joining us today, we have a board member from SSDP. Katie Stone is on the line. Katie, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for doing the show. It's so great to have SSDP featured in any way. We appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. SSDP churns out some of the best drug policy reform advocates out there. A lot of SSDP alumni in very important positions in consulting firms and other organizations that are doing work not just in the marijuana world, but all over the world of drug policy reform. It's a great organization. And Katie, when did you get involved with SSDP?
Let's see. I got involved with SSDP at UC Davis back in 2013. I was then a young and inspired pre-med student, but after going through some personal issues and some other medical things, I realized that I needed to focus all of my work and effort on making sure people had access to the medicines that would make them better, which I did not have access to, and just like my family did not have access to. So I switched up everything I was doing and got involved in policy, and the rest is history.
So access to medications, you're at UC Davis, that's California. It's 2013. They've got a medical marijuana law. How was that a difficulty?
Well, I actually had to relocate to UC Davis. I was originally born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona, and at the time, yes, I'm one of those cannabis refugees in a sense. My employer was not open to the idea of people using cannabis for any reason, and granted, Arizona did not have laws at the time that would have supported it. You know, a test came up. I had the decision to quit my job or go take a test I knew I would have failed. And so I decided to quit my job. And it ended up opening up all of these amazing and wonderful opportunities. I left the University of Arizona and came to UC Davis, where I was greeted with warm and welcoming arms. And it was definitely a good decision.
So you got in undergrad as pre-med. Did you continue on the medical track, or how did your educational career turn out?
Well, it did not stay on the medical track in that sense. I was interning with the Sacramento County Coroner's Office in 2012 and 2013, and what I was responsible for was helping the coroner conduct autopsies to determine the cause of death in various different set of cases. And the most common case that we ended up seeing were indigent people coming in who had died from exposure or died from lack of just basic standard medical care. And through that process, I realized that the policies that were supposed to support a medical system that I believed in did not exist. And so if I wanted to actually be of any sort of benefit and help the communities I was trying to serve, I needed to focus on a policy perspective instead. So I switched up all of that and focused on community development and finished my undergrad. And then I went into a transformative leadership program at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. And there was where I was able to focus on my activism and advocacy work and figure out how I wanted to bring about these changes that I was so compelled to see and actually start organizing people around them. So it was very helpful to my SSDP work as well, and definitely the best decision I could have made.
Wow, it sounds like an interesting development. So you finished your master's. Are you going for a PhD at this point?
I sure am. I am going to be, as long as my paperwork comes through, I will be starting this fall at the same school at the California Institute of Integral Studies, focusing on transformative studies, which is a fancy way of saying social change. And so we do that by focusing not only on ourselves and working on the issues and the growth that we need to focus on as individuals, but then understanding how we bring that best and most authentic version of ourselves into the social justice work that we're trying to create. So it was just a perfect partnership, and we'll see where things end up. I focused most of my research the last 2 years, as you said, looking at environmental sustainability and corporate social responsibility. And I've learned a lot. I've had a lot of different internships with DPA, with the ARCView Group, with the California Cannabis Industry Association. And through all of that, I've had a very good overview of what the state of the industry is and what all of the regulators and investors and entrepreneurs and patients are looking for, and trying to figure out a way to bring this millennial perspective, as I call it, into cannabis policy as a whole.
When you mentioned environmental sustainability and corporate responsibility, two issues jumped right out at me. With the environmental sustainability issue, it's that we're legalizing marijuana all across the United States in medical or adult use states. And many times there's severe limitations on outdoor growing, forcing people to grow indoors, which uses power, which increases our carbon footprint. So that's the environmental thing I wanted to ask you about. And then I also wanted to ask on the corporate responsibility tip, we hear a lot about, black people getting busted in the war on drugs. But now that we've legalized weed, the laws get set up in such a way that they can't participate in the legal market. So there's one for environment. There's one for social justice. What's your take on those issues?
That's a great place to start. So the environmental issue, obviously energy is the biggest component of this, and you're absolutely right. Everyone is so afraid of just the smell of cannabis leaking into a community that they'll more easily put that inside and not worry about letting the plant grow naturally as it does outside in the sunlight and the moonlight for that matter. And there's not much you can do aside from trying to figure out how to address people's fears around that. So I'm not going to be the expert on what is the most sustainable way of growing or what type of HVAC system to use or any of those things. But what I have been able to do is connect people with the types of resources and organizations that work on all of this. So I've definitely been able to advocate and be an activist in that sense by connecting people. But what I've really, really been trying to do is change the culture around sustainability within the cannabis industry by looking at what we call the low-hanging fruit. So it's one thing to try and explain to an investor or to a cultivator that they need to completely change the way that they've been growing for the last few decades in order to meet these new efficiency standards. That's a lot to do, and businesses have plenty enough on their plate. So trying to change their processes is, it's a lot of risk and it's a lot of fear that they have going into that. But if we focus on the consumer aspect of this, we start getting consumers to show that there is a market for sustainably grown cannabis. If we can help educate consumers on something as simple as packaging recycling, or start getting them aware of the fact that every single vapor pen that is produced in this country ends up in a landfill, then maybe we can start changing the conversation, show that there's a market for sustainably produced cannabis, that it's a stronger market, and that this more efficient way of doing things will eventually win overall. And that's how we can hopefully get policies in place that actually make sense. So it's a different way of going about doing it as opposed to focusing on the science aspect. I think focusing on the consumer education and providing a story that there's a market around it is the best way to go about doing this. And then as far as the diversity piece, that's a very difficult thing. The Prop 64 campaign that happened in California, obviously equity and diversity was a very, very critical component of this, and we made it clear that we would not be restricting anyone from accessing licenses solely because they had a criminal record of any kind. Now, I'm sure some of your listeners are paying attention to what's going on in Massachusetts, where we recently had some issues that, I think they've been ironed out a little bit better from the last time I looked online. But the thing of it is, we need to make more of a stand about the equity and diversity issue in cannabis. There's no way around it. And it's impossible to try and explain this to investors and regulators in a way that they understand because they've not grown up in this industry. They've not grown up as victims of the drug war. I mean, I was how old was I? 1985. My gosh, I was so young when I was going to my first DARE classes and seeing everything that was happening to people who were being prosecuted. And it was all people of color. I grew up in Arizona. I was pulled over as a young person for different offenses and was never cited for anything solely because of the fact that I was not a person of color. I was a white girl that got a warning and got away. And that stuck with me. And so it stuck with me, and I knew my peers, and I knew my community, and I knew that this was going to be important going forward. But trying to explain that to someone who's never been embedded within this community and who has never had that kind of perspective, it's very difficult. And you're doing this across lives of extreme stigmatization. Cannabis in general is it's a sin for some people. That's how they view it. So trying to explain that not only are we trying to legalize cannabis, we're also trying to make sure that those who have ever been prosecuted have access to this type of industry. It does not compute. It is very difficult to find that conversation. And so what we've really been trying to focus on is telling those personal stories in such a way, one-on-one, not through big advertising campaigns or not through these massive legal pushes, but actually trying to tell the stories in community, in a setting where people can stop and hear and understand and put themselves into someone else's shoes. And that's a hard thing to pull off, but SSDP does a great job of doing that. Our students are amazing, absolutely incredible at pulling this off. And as long as we continue to make space for people to share stories and experiences in a positive and compassionate way, I think eventually we can get to the point where someone can understand why these issues matter. Just making a policy around it doesn't do enough. We need to be able to explain the reason behind it. And it's something that we've seen within the application processes. You'll often come across a checkbox in your cannabis license application for your municipality, or for your city, and they'll make sure that you have an environmental program in place or that you have a community engagement program in place. And so you'll just simply check off that box, but no one actually goes in to review that plan that's been created. How are you actually giving back to the community? How are you actually giving back to the environment? And what are you actually building to fill off that little check mark? Most people aren't doing their due diligence, and most businesses are not actually setting up anything that's effective. And so that's another thing that we're trying to look at doing, is making sure in the places that are quote unquote being progressive on diversity issues and sustainability issues, we need to make sure that there's enough follow-up in place to guarantee that those wonderful provisions that we fought for are actually being met in a good and realistic and pragmatic way. I could go on forever about that, but I'll stop there.
No, that's fantastic. And I'm sure that people will have a lot of questions and want to know more about this. Maybe students out there that are listening are interested in getting involved with SSDP or hearing from you more about this issue. What are some contact methods they might use to get in touch with you, or maybe some websites where they can find more information on sustainability and corporate responsibility?
Oh, definitely. So you can email me personally anytime at my consulting website. It's Katie, Katie, at gogreenb.org. That's GOGREEN and the letter B.org. And that's what I've been using as a platform to sort of work on developing campaigns around these issues. And what I would do as far as reaching out to organizations working on this, I would point people probably to the Cannabis Certification Council, recently formed, and Ashley Treese is the executive director of that. They just got their initial funding from Dr. Bronner's, which is wonderful, and they are working on cannabis certification around organics, fair trade labor standards, community re-engagement, and all those things. I would also point to an organization called Kind Colorado, and we're looking at getting them expanded to other states as well, but they actually create community engagement plans for businesses who want to make sure that they're being good stewards of the environment in their community too. And along the lines of sustainability, I would probably point people to the Resource Innovation Institute based out of Portland, and who else? Oh, Cannabis Conservancy, also out of California. And I think that would probably be the two places I would send everyone to right now.
Fantastic. What a great load of information. And I assume gogreenb.com would be the website they can find
.org.
More? .org.
Gogreenb.org, yes. And that's where I've been working on something. The biggest campaign that I'm working on organizing right now with a few others is a vape pen recycling campaign. We've been in conversations with TerraCycle to try and get something up and running to actually process those plastic and disposable cartridges that everyone seems to throw everywhere. And we're actually making some progress. They can be recycled. The only issue is that we cannot legally send these things to the recycling facilities, which are located on the East Coast because of federal policy. So we're working on handling that, working on getting something up and running in the state of California so that we can bring zero waste concepts to cannabis, which would make sense, but we're not there yet.
I sure hope we get there soon. I have a little box full of used vape cartridges that I've just not thrown away, thinking somebody must recycle these somewhere, and haven't heard of it yet. So I'm looking forward to you making some progress on
Well,
that.
that's great. I'll have to contact you. We're going to make an art display out of some collected ones, so I'll definitely be in touch.
All right, Katie Stone from SSDP, thanks for joining us here on A Sensible Future, and good luck on your PhD.
Thank you so much, Russ. See you guys next time.
This episode was produced as part of the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville, the daily news and interview podcast covering the world of medical cannabis, adult marijuana, industrial hemp, and spiritual ganja. MJAgenda.com.
New beginner guitars and banjos are often constructed much better than ones built before your time. Why struggle? Get a new instrument or fix the old one. The trusted professionals at the Fingerboard Extension will evaluate your instrument for free. Repairs are priced for people who work for a living. Stop by the Fingerboard Extension downtown Corvallis at 120 Northwest 2nd Street today, or check out its inventory on the web at fingerboardextension.com.
Georgia. Hi, this is Willie Nelson. Alcohol prohibition didn't work in the 1920s, and marijuana prohibition isn't working today. It's time we stopped arresting responsible marijuana smokers. It's the fair thing to do.
For more information, contact NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Call toll-free 888-67-NORML or visit their website at norml.org.
The Marijuana Agenda. Like the gay agenda, only with better music.
I'm Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda. Join me every 4 weeks for Cannabis Sports Medicine from the Gridiron Cannabis Coalition. Learn more at mjagenda.com/about.
Promoting the end of adult cannabis prohibition is easy because we have facts, science, reason, compassion, evidence, truth, and logic on our side. It's even easier when researchers catalog it all for us. Learn how to gather the facts on marijuana use, arrests, seizures, rehabs, drug tests, and more on this edition of Drug War Data Mining.
Today, the Marijuana Arrest Research Project released a major report that was commissioned by the Drug Policy Alliance. It's called Unjust and Unconstitutional: 60,000 Jim Crow Marijuana Arrests in Mayor de Blasio's New York. And the report shows that despite the changing of mayoral administrations and the changing of police commissioners, the NYPD continues to make large numbers of unjust and racially targeted marijuana possession arrests. Despite Mayor de Blasio's campaign promise to end racially biased policing, marijuana possession was New York City's fourth most commonly charged criminal offense in 2016. Black and Latino New Yorkers continue to comprise 85% of the more than 60,000 people arrested for low-level marijuana possession on Mayor de Blasio's watch. 85%. And most people arrested are young blacks and Latinos, even though the studies show that in New York, young whites are using marijuana at higher rates than young blacks and Latinos. The new report shows that the NYPD targets blacks and Latinos for marijuana misdemeanor enforcement all over New York City. There has been some misconception that, sure, they go and target blacks and Latinos in Harlem or in the Bronx or some minority neighborhoods. But one key finding from this report is that in many neighborhoods where blacks and Latinos constitute a small minority of the residents, in other words, mostly white neighborhoods, they're still arrested in higher numbers than white people are in New York City. The New York Police Department is arresting black New Yorkers at 10 times the rate of whites in Manhattan and 15 times the rate of whites in Staten Island. This is all from analysis of marijuana arrest data from the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services and the demographic data from all 5 boroughs. This report was produced again by Marijuana Arrest Research Project, and they were on the steps of New York's City Hall at noon today announcing this, along with Drug Policy Alliance and Marijuana Arrest Research Project, representatives from Latino Justice, Vocal New York, the Brooklyn Defender Services, the Immigrant Defense Project, and numerous individuals who were directly impacted by marijuana prohibition all gathered today at New York City Hall to call out for some change. This continuing disparate use of marijuana laws in a state that has decriminalized marijuana. Remember, marijuana is decriminalized in New York State. Possessing it on your person, and no one can see it, is supposed to be something that you don't get arrested for. But the NYPD continues to play these little games where they convince people to take the marijuana out of their pockets, convince them that they have to do it, even though they don't. And when they do, that's public display of marijuana, and then they go and arrest the people. This is despicable. This is a practice that needs to end, especially considering that Mayor de Blasio came into office in New York City promising a change from the administrations of Giuliani and his other predecessors, who ramped up the marijuana arrest totals in New York City to Herculean proportions, to 50,000 people being arrested per year. We're glad the arrests are fewer, but they need to end. And as they end, they need to end the racial discrimination. You can learn more about the report by visiting drugpolicy.org. It's in their news section today, and I'll post a link in our chat room.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
Hey everybody, it's Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda, inviting you to be like me and get your ink done at Lucky Horseshoe Tattoo, Fort Worth's most female-friendly, clean, sterile, awesome tattoo shop. Thomas and his crew are true artists who can design you a custom piece or use a design you bring in. Lucky Horseshoe also offers all styles of tattooing as well as piercings and all-around fun. In the DFW area, stop by Lucky Horseshoe Tattoo and tell them Radical Russ sent you. Trust me, it'll feel awesome.
This November, whether you see the words medical marijuana on your ballot or not, the issue is there. From the halls of Congress to your state capitol or city hall, politicians are already making decisions on medical marijuana policy on your behalf. This election, make sure they are representing you. Every vote is a vote for medical marijuana.
Visit votemedicalmarijuana.org today.
You're not high. You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
I'm astonished to hear people suggest we can solve our heroin crisis. Have you heard this? By having more marijuana.
Okay, maybe you're a little high.
I'm Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda. Join me every 4 weeks for our Government at Work, the latest in cannabis reform at the local, state, federal, and international level. Learn more at mjagenda.com/about.
Freedom Leaf is the magazine of record for the activists working to end adult marijuana prohibition. Freedom Leaf features the latest activism updates from NORML, SSDP, and Women Grow, plus informative articles from longtime activists and cannabis experts. Join us now as we visit with Freedom Leaf Editor-in-Chief Steve Bloom in this month's Freedom Leaf Preview.
Welcome back, everyone, to another edition of our Freedom Leaf Preview, the magazine of marijuana reform. We've got Editor-in-Chief Steve Bloom with us to give us a preview of the July 2017 issue. And Steve, welcome back to the program.
Hey, Russ, how are you?
I'm doing good. I understand this issue coming up is the summer issue. It's actually covering 2 months.
Yeah, we do that in the summer. We split it up and do July, August issues.
All right. So what are we looking forward to in the upcoming issue of Freedom Leaf?
Well, not only is the summer issue, it's the Summer of Love Revisited issue. So as you probably know, 50 years ago was the so-called Summer of Love in the United States and maybe around the world, but primarily San Francisco and the counterculture hotbeds that were developing back 50 years ago. So we're taking a look back. Issue is a little bit different than our normal issues. It's stuck with a lot of pop coverage, but the whole feature well is devoted to a look back to 50 years ago.
All right, that'll be great. What are we going to learn about the Summer of Love that maybe some of our younger listeners don't know about?
Well, it wasn't all hippies and flower power and patchouli. You know, it was a kind of a rough time in American history back then. 1967, we were right in the middle of the Vietnam War. The anti-war movement was really picking up. It was only 3 years, from some of the civil rights legislation that had passed, so that had been happening just prior to that. There was a lot of tumult in America that led to the counterculture and led to the Summer of Love. JFK's assassination in 63, and then in 68 we'd see 2 more major assassinations. So a lot was happening then, and it wasn't all so pretty. It wasn't, one version of it is, all the hippies descended on San Francisco and had a great time. Another version of it is that there are a lot of other things going on in American life back then.
And was the Summer of Love really just centered around San Francisco, or was this more of a nationwide phenomenon?
It really was international, but San Francisco was the hub. New York's East Village scene was building as a countercultural hub. LA had its scenes, and a lot of the campuses, Ann Arbor and Madison, were developing their scenes as things were sort of picking up. But everything seemed to zero in on San Francisco. That was kind of the place. That's where all the hippies went. That's where the media went, and you've probably seen those famous bus tours going through Haight-Ashbury back then, where they were trying to introduce the hippies to mainstream America. We're touring around trying to get an idea of what was going on in San Francisco. So it really did kind of zero in on San Francisco, and all that great music of that era, not all of it came from San Francisco, but so much of it did. Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, Janis Joplin, Big Brother and the Holding Company, Quicksilver Messenger Service, Santana, the list goes on. It was a great, fervent time for music in the Bay Area, and that's also where we see the birth of the rock festival. Happened that year. The Human Being took place in 67 in January, and then in June there were several major events. There was the Mountain Festival at Mount Tamalpais, which actually gets reenacted every year. There'll be one coming up in September. And then famously the Monterey Pop Festival, which really kind of blew the lid on the whole rock counterculture scene. If people didn't know about it, they finally learned about it when Jimi Hendrix burnt his guitar on stage or lit up his guitar and the Who smashed their stuff. But when you see those images, you think, well, again, it's not all flower power. There was a lot of angriness going on at the time, too.
So in this new issue coming up, July, August, summer issue of Freedom Leaf, are there any interviews for us to look forward to?
Well, we have Wavy Gravy. So he's our special interview for that issue, one of the kind of the clown prince of the counterculture going back to the late 60s. He had the hog farm. He was at Woodstock famously and told everybody they were making breakfast in bed for $400,000. So he's been living off that for a long time. Wavy does a lot of other cool things. He's got the SEVA Foundation for helping people get their sight back or deal with blindness, and also his Camp Winter Rainbow in Northern California, which is going on right now. But we had Wavy just looking back a little bit on, he actually wasn't really in San Francisco at the time. It was kind of like in and around the scene, and he kind of knows everybody. He had a really funny line, though. I asked him, what do you think of Donald Trump? And he says, he said, Richard Nixon was a delicious piece of chocolate cake compared to Donald Trump. So, wow. That's his take on things. So that's our celebrity, so to speak, interview in this issue, our Summer of Love focus. We also have, as I was saying about the summer festivals, we have an excerpt from a great book called 1967 by Harvey Kubernick, and we have a look at the long, strange script, Great Grateful Dead documentary that just came out, this summer, and look back on Sgt. Pepper's, which was 50 years old. So it's a little bit of a throwback.
Sounds like an excellent issue coming up. And, of course, Freedom Leaf Magazine being the magazine for marijuana reform, you work well with NORML and SSDP and Women Grow. Are there some reform-oriented articles or information in this upcoming issue for those groups?
Absolutely. Every issue, those three groups you just mentioned, Normal, SSDP, and Women Grow, have columns in the magazine to discuss whatever it is that they want to talk about. We were introduced to the Connecticut group that's just joined Women Grow, and the issue SSDP kind of gives an overview of what some of their chapters are doing with a little tie into the peace and love theme. And Normal, continues to hammer away at some, Washington related anti-drug policies, so they kind of want to let people know what we're sort of up against. And Paul Montano, who is the deputy director of Normal, he's always in the magazine. He focuses on the future of cannabis sales in California, and of course the Nevada story is a big story, and it's got a home base for us. It's Freedom Leaf's based in Las Vegas, so legal sales of recreational marijuana started July 1st, so we're keeping an eye on that. We're also Amanda Ryman is moved up to Northern California with her company Flocana, and they are kind of exploring the winery model as to how you can kind of make marijuana available the way wineries do. So that's an interesting focus of what's happening there. We have our news section by Mona Zhang, which zeroes in on Uruguay, which has its legal sales that just started this month. Updates in Arkansas, Florida, Maine, Massachusetts, North Dakota, all those states that passed laws back in November. A lot of the laws are being changed by the legislatures to give people a handle on that. What's happening with social use in Colorado, that's been a big issue. And we also zero in on the DOJ's secret marijuana subcommittee that we're kind of waiting to hear what they're going to come up with and what their proposals will be. It's not going to be good, but they're supposed to announce something by the end of this month. And the back of the magazine, which is a little more cultural, Sherry Sicard does kind of a flashback to macrobiotic cooking, which was sort of the terminology back then for what now is considered vegan eating. Very clean, eating, no meat of any sort, no dairy, very, almost bland, but good for you. So she does what we call the Summer of Veg recipes. We also have an article about hemp beers by Aaron Hyatt, and we have our columnist Beth Mann, who's sojourning in England, explaining how difficult it is to get stoned there. We also have a new column by Dr. Frank D'Ambrosio, who's doing our, kind of Dr. Frank recommends. This month he talks about microdosing on edibles, and as I said, we have a review of Sgt. Pepper's. We also have in the middle of the magazine the overall summer love focus. It's a guide to San Francisco and a guide to Amsterdam. So, what's happening, in both places, a little history of both, and what are the things you could do if you're in San Francisco this summer, all the different fun things you could do as far as, different exhibits and galleries and photo exhibits and all kinds of displays all around town. Plus, in Guy O'Beelan, one of our favorites, he does his for each place for San Francisco and Oakland. He gives like 5 stony places to go, and he pairs those places with a good strain. Like if you're going to go to the beach in San Francisco, then you need this particular strain. If you're going to go to the park, you need that strain. So that's kind of fun. It pretty much covers the whole issue.
I was going to say, we've got a pretty jam-packed issue coming up for the summer here at Freedom Leaf. So let's give our listeners the information they need to get their hands on a copy.
Well, Freedom Leaf is available at trade shows and through Normal and SSDP and Women Grow chapters. Wherever they have events, there should be a Freedom Leaf. We're also in a lot of stores in legal states, California, Colorado, Washington. We don't have a really long list. You have to kind of go find it. It's also available digitally. This issue will be up in the next day or two at freedomleaf.com, so you can go check out the issue free of charge and our digital version. And we take probably half the articles out of each issue and we post them. So we'll start doing that as pretty much as soon as this issue is out. So bit by bit, you'll get your stories as well. If you're not looking to read it in one way, hard copy, digital, you can find it, online, in a blog format. So one way or the other, you'll get your news, the good news about marijuana from Freedom Leaf.
That's what we wanted to hear. FreedomLeaf.com. You can follow him on Twitter at Freedom Leaf Inc. And Steve Bloom is the editor-in-chief of Freedom Leaf Magazine, the magazine for marijuana reformers. Hey, thanks so much for giving us the clue in on what's happening for the summer issue. And I hope you have a great summer there at Freedom Leaf and in New York City.
Same to you. I'll catch you in September.
This episode was produced as part of the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville, the daily news and interview podcast covering the world of medical cannabis, adult marijuana, industrial hemp, and spiritual ganja. MJagenda.com.
Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville is proudly sponsored by the Marijuana Business Association. The MJBA, called by NBC News the Cannabis Chamber of Commerce, is the fastest growing business association and the fastest growing industry in America. I've been working with the MJBA for years, and I personally invite you to join the MJBA. MJBA also publishes the popular MJ Headline News on Facebook and the MJNewsNetwork.com and Marijuana Channel 1 on YouTube. Visit mjba.net for more details.
Did you know that in Georgia, 1 in 13 adults is in jail or prison or on parole or probation? As a mother and as a professional, I advocate for access to drug treatment instead of incarceration. We need you to join us in this important fight. This October, we're coming to Atlanta for the 2017 Drug Policy Alliance Reform Conference. Come lend your voice to the fight. Register now at reformconference.org.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
I'm Russ Belville with the Marijuana Agenda. Join me every 2 weeks for Cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earlywine from the Burning Issues podcast on CannabisRadio.com. Learn more at mjagenda.com/about.
Total war against public enemy number one.
10 federal criminal penalties for up to 1 ounce of marijuana.
Marijuana is probably the most dangerous drug.
Legalization is just another word for surrender.
I experimented with marijuana and didn't inhale.
This is not medicine. This is a Cheech and Chong show.
Encourage people to use less drugs.
I inhaled.
That was the point.
I think it would be a mistake to legalize.
Negative reports coming out of Colorado.
People don't smoke marijuana.
Radical Rant.
Ladies and gentlemen, there is no war on drugs. There never has been. I know that quote must be news to those of you who have been body slammed by SWAT teams breaking down your door and forcing you to the floor in handcuffs while they loot your home over an anonymous tip that you might have been cultivating some houseplants in your garage. However, it was for your own good and the good of the nation. At least that's the attitude of the agents working for the Drug Enforcement Administration. See, the DEA has this museum, and in April, former Special Agent Jeff Stamm delivered a lecture there in the DEA's Why We Fight series. But when you hear these quotes, however, you have to remind yourself that the speech was from April of this very year, from a living human being who presumably has access to the internet and a functioning brain. These are not something from the archives of Harry J. Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, some 80 years ago. Stamm, the former DEA agent, talks about the sellers of drugs as a, quote, constant onslaught of amoral predators who leave only human suffering and social decay in their never-ending pursuit of riches, end quote. Now, he's only referring to the greedy pushers of illegal drugs, of course. The pill pushers who went from selling $45 million to $1.1 billion worth of OxyContin in the first 5 years, well, they don't count. And the booze peddlers who sell $16.75 billion worth of Budweiser last year, they're exempt as well. That's because booze and pills cause no human suffering and social decay, I suppose. Quote, it's time that we reclaim our culture and our civilization, Stamm exhorts, presumably from the now 3 in 5 Americans who support marijuana legalization. Stamm lists, quote, a polluted pop culture with our nation's leaders at all levels, pandering to proliferating groups of selfish and mercenary factions who are peddlers of a limitless and lawless democracy, whose arguments are based in intellectual preening and self-applauding compassion. End quote. Yeah, funny how we're the ones asking for laws to regulate marijuana. The only ones who want to keep marijuana limitless and lawless are STAM and the DEA. Well, and the Mexican cartels who don't want legal American competition. To STAM, anybody who's questioning the effectiveness of the past 40-year, trillion-dollar drug war is part of a, quote, zealous and committed pro-dope cabal that includes the likes of so-called experts like Brad Pitt, who calls the drug war a charade, Sir Richard Branson, who calls the drug war a failure because America, he believes, now runs a police and prison state, and Vicente Fox, the former president of Mexico, who claims that drug war is useless, end quote. Well, according to STAM, just because we only have 5% of the world's population but over 20% of the world's prisoners, you can't call us a police and prison state, I see. He continues, quote, on any given day in our country, there are roughly 2.4 million people behind bars. Of that total, right at 16% are there for drug offenses, end quote. Now, let's see, 2.4 million, 16%. When you do the math, you learn that's 384,000 people behind bars in this country just for drugs. And if you do some Googling, you'll find that we have more people in prison just for drugs, take just our drug prisoners, and we have got more people in prison than all the people in prison in any country on earth except 4. China, Brazil, Russia, and India. Our drug population alone is the world's 5th largest prison population. And somehow, in communist China, where there are nearly 1.4 billion people, and the same drugs are just as or more illegal, they've only imprisoned 1.6 million of their people. In the land of the free, with 321 million people, we've imprisoned 2.4 million. China has over 4 times more people, but we have 50% more prisoners. It's all necessary, STAM argues, to battle drugs and, quote, new potent strains of marijuana misused for cheap pleasures, causing the pernicious and insidious decay that dope spawns in both the user and society, end quote. Yet, for all this alleged decay in society, Americans stubbornly keep supporting marijuana legalization. Well, that's because, as STAM explains, the public is stupid and easily fooled by, quote, reckless and illegitimate accusations that the drug war has not only failed, but that it's patently racist and oppressive, end quote. See, those of us in the pro-dope cabal just, quote, bully and confuse a sleepwalking population too timid and self-absorbed to argue, end quote. Yeah, right. Who hasn't felt bullied into thinking the drug war is patently racist by the darn ACLU reporting that black people are nearly 4 times more likely to be busted for weed than white people? You dirty bullies. And you, dear listener, if you weren't so self-absorbed, you wouldn't have been so confused as to think that shooting family pets in the home while kids are present over a few grams of pot was somehow offensive and oppressive. Through our incredible powers of explaining statistics and publishing police body cam videos, somehow we've created a pandemic public ignorance, he calls it, through, quote, a forced compulsion to non-judgmentalism and pervasive compassion, leading to surrendering to the false hopes of both utopian liberals and fundamentalist libertarians who preach that drug prohibition does more harm than good, end quote. See, what we so-called utopian fundamentalists don't understand, STAM argues, is that the drug war is actually succeeding. He says, quote, the success of our drug policies is evidenced by the long-term reductions in the drug use rates in the country, end quote. All right, well, STAM points out that in 1979, 14% of the population aged 12 and older had used an illicit drug in the past month, compared to just 9% today. STAM concedes, quote, now this may not be winning, but it sure as hell isn't losing, end quote, which kind of suggests that Stam believes that 0% drug use would be winning. So now who's the utopian fundamentalist? It's very telling that what Agent Stam considers success is reduction in the use of drugs, not the harm from drugs. Because sure, yeah, in 1979, 14% of the population used drugs monthly, but only 2,475 people died from an overdose. So yeah, you can crow all you like that it's down to 9% of the people using drugs, but we're forecasting over 60,000 overdose deaths in the most recent year. Those of us that point that out, quote, intend to grossly mislead and hoodwink sometimes an all too susceptible public, to decriminalize drugs on behalf of the mere 9% of our population who seek only unlimited forms of self-gratification would not simply be reckless, it would be suicidal, end quote. Yes, the hoodwinked, susceptible, bamboozled public. Y'all are stupid. You have no idea what's going on when you think we ought to legalize drugs. Because after all, we all remember the decline and fall of Portugal, right? Which decriminalized all drugs in 2001 with their 95% reduction in new HIV infections, with their 80% reduction in overdose deaths, with half the heroin users they used to have, and with drug use rates roughly comparable to the rest of Europe. Oh my God, it's a deplorable hellhole, isn't it? See, folks, when you peel away the reefer madness behind all of this, what you find is that Stam's thesis for why we fight is not dissimilar to the dehumanization employed by vicious demagogues throughout history, from the Nazis who referred to the Jews as vermin, to the Hutu who referred to the Tutsi as cockroaches. Stam says, quote, ultimately, the crisis of dope is one that is deeply rooted in attitudes and behaviors, and therefore will require a citizenry that is unafraid to confront those among us who infect and rot our nation from within. End quote. We're an infection now to be eradicated. Got some sort of final solution for us, I understand. And that infectious rot starts with marijuana, or as Stam refers to it, quote, marijuana for kids. I presume he means CBD for epileptic toddlers. The context isn't very clear. As he discusses both the opioid overdose crisis and the flood of Mexican-produced methamphetamine coming in from the cartels, he says, quote, every heroin addict out there is not just a heroin user. For the most part, they are polydrug users, and they've started with at least marijuana. We have to make this struggle something that's stigmatized again. End quote. Yeah. Because that's what's been missing from the lives of people with drug dependency issues, stigma. He continues, quote, stigma is actually much more important than law in keeping citizens in line with each other to maximize liberty for all of us. So, although addiction requires our help and our compassion, Stam adds unconvincingly, there is a lot more folks out there that aren't drug addicts. They are recreational drug users. And we have to criticize and stigmatize that kind of behavior. End quote. You know, you can't help but think of South Park's counselor, Mr. Mackey, when you hear Stam explain his drugs are bad, okay, plan to stigmatize us all into quitting. Somehow, piss testing us, profiling us, raiding us, killing our pets, seizing our assets, and taking our liberty, that didn't convince us to give up the devil's lettuce, but society wagging its finger and telling us we're naughty. Oh, that'll do the trick. Stam laments, quote, there has been a lot of folks that have vilified and made fun of Nancy Reagan's Just Say No program years ago, but for those who have done some research on the matter, it worked. Just Say No was not intended to impress our sophisticated elites in this country. It was created to impress 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds. And it worked surprisingly well. Well, Nancy Reagan began the Just Say No campaign in 1982. I was 14 years old at the time, so I guess it didn't work so surprisingly well on me. And according to the studies, on anybody, really. It would be easy to dismiss DEA's Jeff Stam as yet another one of the prohibitionist dinosaurs, screeching its death throes as it sinks into the tar pits of history. That is, until you remember that the DEA is controlled by a Department of Justice run by an 80s throwback who worships Just Say No more than Stam does, Attorney General Jeff Sessions. And Stam seems impressed by the new boss, saying, quote, "We need to do better at letting folks know that drug use is unacceptable," lamenting and echoing similar comments by Jeff Sessions. "It's something that you maybe can survive, but at large, it's something that society can't. So without getting into specifics on policies and things of the previous administration,